Part 7 of Prose Romances from the Oxford and Cambridge Magazine by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Svent and his Brethren. Oxford and Cambridge Magazine, August 1856. A king in the olden time ruled over a mighty nation. A proud man he must have been, any man who was king of that nation. Hundreds of lords, each a prince over many people, sat about him in the council chamber, under the dim vault that was blue like the vault of heaven and shone with innumerable glistenings of golden stars. North, south, east, and west spread that land of his. The sea did not stop it. His empire clomb the high mountains and spread abroad its arms over the valleys of them. All along the sea line shone cities set with their crowns of towers in the midst of broad bays, each fit, it seemed, to be a harbour for the navies of all the world. Inland the pastures and cornlands lay, checkered much with climbing, over-tumbling grapevines, under the sun that crumbled their clods and drew up the young wheat in the springtime, under the rain that made the long grass soft and fine, under all the fair fertilizing influences. The streams leapt down from the mountain tops, or cleft their way through the ridged ravines. They grew great rivers, like seas each one. The mountains were cloven and gave forth from their scarred sides wealth of ore and splendour of marble, all things this people that King Valdemar ruled over could do. They levelled mountains that over the smooth roads the wains might go, laden with silk and spices from the sea. They drained lakes, that the land might yield more and more, as year by year the serfs, driven like cattle, but worse fed, worse housed, died slowly, scarce knowing that they had souls. They builded them huge ships, and said that they were masters of the sea too, only, I trow, the sea was an unruly subject, and often sent back their ships cut into more pieces than the pines of them were, when the adze first fell upon them. They raised towers and bridges and marble palaces with endless corridors rose-scented and cooled with welling fountains. They sent great armies and fleets to all the points of heaven that the wind blows from, who took and burned many happy cities, wasted many fields and valleys, blotted out from the memory of men the names of nations, made their men's lives a hopeless shame and misery to them, their women's lives disgrace, and then came home to have flowers thrown on them in showers, to be feasted and called heroes. Should not then their king be proud of them? Moreover, they could fashion stone and brass into the shapes of men. They could write books. They knew the names of the stars and their number. They knew what moved the passions of men in the hearts of them, and could draw you up cunningly catalogues of virtues and vices. Their wise men could prove to you that any lie was true, that any truth was false, till your head grew dizzy and your heart sick, and you almost doubted if there were a God. Should not then their king be proud of them? Their men were strong in body and moved about gracefully like dancers, and the purple-black scented hair of their gold-clothed knights seemed to shoot out rays under the blaze of light that shone like many suns in the king's halls. Their women's faces were very fair in red and white, their skins fair and half transparent like the marble of their mountains, and their voices sounded like the rising of soft music from step to step of their own white palaces. Should not then their king be proud of such a people, who seemed to help so in carrying on the world to its consummate perfection, which they even hoped their grandchildren would see? Alas, alas! They were slaves, king and priest, noble and burgher, just as much as the meanest tasked serf, perhaps more even than he, for they were so willingly, but he unwillingly enough. They could do everything but justice and truth and mercy. Therefore God's judgments hung over their heads, not fallen yet, but surely to fall one time or other. For ages past they had warred against one people only, whom they could not utterly subdue, a feeble people in numbers, dwelling in the very midst of them among the mountains. Yet now they were pressing them close. Acre after acre, with seas of blood to purchase each acre, had been wrested from the free people, and their end seemed drawing near. And this time the King Waldemar had marched to their land with a great army to make war on them, he boasted to himself, almost for the last time. A walled town in the free land. In that town a house built of rough splintery stones, and in a great low-browed room of that house a grey-haired man pacing to and fro impatiently. "Will she never come?" he says. "It is 2 hours since the sun set. News, too, of the enemies being in the land. How dreadful if she is taken!" His great broad face is marked with so many furrows made by the fierce restless energy of the man, but there is a wearied look on it, the look of a man who, having done his best, is yet beaten. He seemed to long to be gone and be at peace. He, the fighter in many battles, who often had seemed with his single arm to roll back the whole tide of fight, felt despairing enough now. This last invasion, he thought, must surely quite settle the matter. Wave after wave, wave after wave had broken on that dear land, and been rolled back from it, and still the hungry sea pressed on. They must be finally drowned in that sea. How fearfully they had been tried for their sins! Back again to his anxiety concerning Sisella, his daughter, go his thoughts, and he still paces up and down wearily, stopping now and then to gaze intently on things which he had seen 100 times. And the night has altogether come on. At last the blast of a horn from outside, challenge and counter-challenge, and the wicket to the courtyard is swung open, for this house, being in a part of the city where the walls are somewhat weak, is a little fortress in itself, and is very carefully guarded. The old man's face brightened at the sound of the newcomers, and he went toward the entrance of the house, where he was met by 2 young knights, fully armed, and a maiden. "Thank God you are come," he says, but stops when he sees her face, which is quite pale, almost wild with some sorrow. "The saints! Sisella, what is it?" he says.
"Father, Eric will tell you."
Then suddenly a clang, for Eric has thrown on the ground a richly jewelled sword, sheathed, and sets his foot on it, crunching the pearls on the sheath. Then says, flinging up his head, "There, father, the enemy is in the land. May that happen to every one of them. But for my part I have accounted for 2 already. Son Eric, you talk for ever about yourself. Quick, tell me about Sisella instead. If you go on boasting and talking always about yourself, you will come to no good end, son, after all." But as he says this, he smiles nevertheless, and his eye glistens. "Well, father, listen. Such a strange thing she tells us, not to be believed if she did not tell us herself. The enemy has suddenly got generous, one of them at least, which is something of a disappointment to me. Pardon about myself again. And that is about myself too. Well, father, what am I to do? But Sisella, she wandered some way from her maidens when... but I could never tell a story properly. Let her tell it herself. Here, Sisella. Well, I see she is better employed. Talking, namely, how should I know what? With Sieur at the window seat yonder. But she told us that, as she wandered almost by herself, she presently heard shouts and saw many of the enemy's knights riding quickly towards her, whereat she knelt only and prayed to God, who was very gracious to her. For when, as she thought, something dreadful was about to happen, the chief of the knights, a very noble-looking man, she said, rescued her, and, after he had gazed earnestly into her face, told her that she might go back again to her own home, and her maids with her, if only she would tell him where she dwelt and her name. And withal he sent 3 knights to escort her some way toward the city. Then he turned and rode away with all his knights, but those 3, who, when they knew that he had quite gone, she says, began to talk horribly, saying things whereof in her terror she understood the import only. Then, before worse came to pass, came I and slew 2, as I said, and the other ran away, lustily with a good courage. And that is the sword of one of the slain knights, or, as one might rather call them, rascally caitiffs." The old man's thoughts seemed to have gone wandering after his son had finished, for he said nothing for some time, but at last spoke dejectedly. ' Eric, brave son, when I was your age I too hoped, and my hopes are come to this at last. You are blind in your hopeful youth, Eric, and do not see that this king — for the king it certainly was — will crush us, and not the less surely because he is plainly not ungenerous, but rather a good, courteous knight. Alas, poor old Gunnar, broken down now and ready to die, as your country is. How often in the olden time thou used to say to thyself as thou didst ride at the head of our glorious house, " This charge may finish this matter, this battle must." They passed away, those gallant fights, and still the foe pressed on, and hope, too, slowly ebbed away, as the boundaries of our land grew less and less. Behold, this is the last wave but one or two, and then for a sad farewell to name and freedom. Yet surely the end of the world must come when we are swept off the face of the earth. God waits long, they say, before he avenges his own.' As he was speaking, Sieur and Sisela came nearer to him, and Sisela, all traces of her late terror gone from her face now, raising her lips to his bended forehead, kissed him fondly, and said with glowing face, ' Father, how can I help our people ? Do they want deaths ? I will die. Do they want happiness ? I will live miserably through the years and years, nor ever pray for death.' Some hope or other seemed growing up in his heart and showing through his face, and he spoke again, putting back the hair from off her face and clasping it about with both his hands, while he stooped to kiss her. ' God remember your mother, Sisela. Then it was no dream after all, but true perhaps, as indeed it seemed at the time. But it must come quickly, that woman's deliverance, or not at all. When was it that I heard that old tale that sounded even then true to my ears? For we have not been punished for naught, my son. That is not God's way. It comes across my memory somehow, mingled in a wonderful manner with the purple of the pines on the hillside, with the fragrance of them borne from far towards me. For know, my children, that in times past, long, long past now, we did an evil deed. For our forefathers, who have been dead now and forgiven so long ago, once mad with rage at some defeat from their enemies, fired a church and burned therein many a woman who had fled thither for refuge. And from that time a curse cleaves to us, only they say that at the last we may be saved from utter destruction by a woman. I know not. God grant it may be so.' Then she said, ' Father, brother, and you, Sieur, come with me to the chapel. I wish you to witness me make an oath.' Her face was pale, her lips were pale, her golden hair was pale, but not pale, it seemed, from any sinking of blood, but from gathering of intensest light from somewhere — her eyes, perhaps, for they appeared to burn inwardly. They followed the sweeping of her purple robe in silence through the low, heavy beamed passages. They entered the little chapel, dimly lighted by the moon that night, as it shone through one of the 3 arrow slits of windows at the east end. There was little wealth of marble there, I trow, little time had those fighting men for stone smoothing, albeit one noted many semblances of flowers even in the dim half light, and here and there the faces of brave men, roughly cut enough, but grand because the hand of the carver had followed his loving heart. Neither was there gold wanting to the altar and the canopy, and above the low pillars of the nave hung banners, taken from the foe by the men of that house, gallant with gold and jewels. She walked up to the altar and took the blessed book of the Gospels from the left side of it, then knelt in prayer for a moment or two, while the 3 men stood behind her reverently. When she rose, she made a sign to them, and from their scabbards gleamed 3 swords in the moonlight. Then, when they held them aloft and pointed toward the altar, she opened the book at the page whereon was painted Christ the Lord dying on the cross, pale against the gleaming gold. She said in a firm voice, ' Christ God, who diedst for all men, so help me, as I refuse not life,
happiness, even honour, for this people whom I love."
Then she kissed the face so pale against the gold, and knelt again. But when she had risen, and before she could leave the space by the altar, Sieur had stepped up to her and seized her hurriedly, folding both his arms about her. She let herself be held there, her bosom against his. Then he held her away from him a little space, holding her by the arms near the shoulder. Then he took her hands and led them across his shoulders, so that now she held him. And they said nothing. What could they say? Do you know any word for what they meant? And the father and brother stood by, looking quite awestruck, more so they seemed than by her solemn oath, till Sieur, raising his head from where it lay, cried out aloud, "May God forgive me, as I am true to her! Hear you, father and brother!" Then said Sisera, "May God help me in my need, as I am true to Sieur." And the others went, and they too were left standing there alone, with no little awe over them, strange and shy as they had never been to each other. Sisera shuddered, and said in a quick whisper,
"Sieur, on your knees, and pray that these oaths may never clash."
"Can they, Sisera?" he said.
"Oh, love," she cried, "you have loosed my hand. Take it again, or I shall die, Sieur."
He took both her hands. He held them fast to his lips, to his forehead. He said, "No, God does not allow such things. Truth does not lie. You are truth. This need not be prayed for." She said,
"Oh, forgive me. Yet this old chapel is damp and cold, even in the burning summer weather. Oh, knight Sieur, something strikes through me. I pray you, kneel and pray."
He looked steadily at her for a long time without answering, as if he were trying once and for all to become indeed one with her, then said, "Yes, it is possible. In no other way could you give up everything." Then he took off from his finger a thin golden ring, and broke it in two, and gave her the one half, saying, "When will they come together?" Then within a while they left the chapel, and walked, as in a dream, between the dazzling lights of the hall where the knights sat now, and between those lights sat down together, dreaming still the same dream each of them, while all the knights shouted for Sieur and Sisera. Even if a man had spent all his life looking for sorrowful things, even if he sought for them with all his heart and soul, and even though he had grown grey in that quest, yet would he have found nothing in all the world, or perhaps in all the stars either, so sorrowful as Sisera. They had accepted her sacrifice after long deliberation. They had arrayed her in purple and scarlet. They had crowned her with gold wrought about with jewels. They had spread abroad the veil of her golden hair. Yet now, as they led her forth in the midst of the band of knights, her brother Eric holding fast her hand, each man felt like a murderer when he beheld her face, whereon was no tear, wherein was no writhing of muscle, twitching of nerve, wherein was no sorrow mark of her own, but only the sorrow mark which God sent her, and which she must perforce wear. Yet they had not caught eagerly at her offer. They had said at first, almost to a man, "Nay, this thing shall not be. Let us die altogether rather than this." Yet, as they sat and said this, to each man of the council came floating dim memories of that curse of the burned women and its remedy. To many it ran rhythmically, an old song better known by the music than the words, heard once and again long ago when the gusty wind overmastered the chestnut boughs and strewed the smooth sward with their star leaves. Withal came thoughts to each man, partly selfish, partly wise and just, concerning his own wife and children, concerning children yet unborn, thoughts too of the glory of the old name, and all that had been suffered and done in that glorious free land might yet be a nation. And the spirit of hope, never dead but sleeping only, woke up within their hearts. "We may yet be a people," they said to themselves, "if we can but get breathing time." And as they thought these things and doubted, Sieur rose up in the midst of them and said, "You are right in what you think, countrymen, and she is right. She is altogether good and noble. Send her forth." Then, with one look of utter despair at her, as she stood statue-like, he left the council, lest he should fall down and die in the midst of them, he said. Yet he died not then, but lived for many years afterwards. But they rose from their seats, and when they were armed, and she royally arrayed, they went with her, leading her through the dear streets, whence you always saw the great pine-shadowed mountains. She went away from all that was dear to her, to go and sit a crowned queen in the dreary marble palace, whose outer walls rose right up from the weary-hearted sea. She could not think, she durst not, she feared, if she did, that she would curse her beauty, almost curse the name of love, curse Sieur, although she knew he was right, for not slaying her. She feared that she might curse God. So she thought not at all, steeping her senses utterly in forgetfulness of the happy past, destroying all anticipation of the future. Yet as they left the city amid the tears of women and fixed sorrowful gaze of men, she turned round once and stretched her arms out involuntarily, like a dumb senseless thing, towards the place where she was born, and where her life grew happier day by day, and where his arms first crept round about her. She turned away and thought, but in a cold speculative manner, how it was possible that she was bearing this sorrow, as she often before had wondered, when slight things vexed her overmuch, how people had such sorrows and lived, and almost doubted if the pain was so much greater in great sorrows than in small troubles, or whether the nobleness only was greater, the pain not sharper but more lingering. Half-way toward the camp the King's people met her, and over the trampled ground where they had fought so fiercely but a little time before, they spread breadth of golden cloth, that her feet might not touch the arms of her dead countrymen or their brave bodies. And so they came at last, with many trumpet blasts, to the King's tent, who stood at the door of it to welcome his bride that was to be, a noble man truly to look on, kindly and genial-eyed. The red blood sprang up over his face when she came near, and she looked back no more, but bowed before him almost to the ground, and would have knelt, but that he caught her in his arms and kissed her. She was pale no more now, and the King, as he gazed delightedly at her, did not notice that sorrow mark which was plain enough to her own people. So the trumpet sounded again, one long peal that seemed to make all the air reel and quiver, and the soldiers and lords shouted, "Hurrah for the Peace Queen, Sisela!" "Come, Harold," said a beautiful golden-haired boy to one who was plainly his younger brother. "Come and let us leave Robert here by the forge, and show our Lady Mother this beautiful thing. Sweet Master Armourer, farewell." "Are you going to the Queen, then?" said the Armourer. "Yea," said the boy, looking wonderingly at the strong craftsman's eager face. "But nay, let me look at you a while longer. You remind me so much of one I loved long ago in my own land. Stay a while till your older brother goes with you." "Well, I will stay, and think of what you have been telling me. I do not feel as if I should ever think of anything else for long together, as long as I live." So he sat down again on an old battered anvil, and seemed with his bright eyes to be beholding something in the land of dreams. A gallant dream it was he dreamed, for he saw himself with his brothers and friends about him, seated on a throne, the justest king in all the earth, his people the lovingest of all people. He saw the ambassadors of the restored nations that had been unjustly dealt with long ago. Everywhere love and peace if possible, justice and truth at all events. Alas, he knew not that vengeance so long delayed must fall at last in his lifetime. He knew not that it takes longer to restore that whose growth has been through age and age than the few years of a lifetime. Yet was the reality good, if not as good as the dream. Presently his twin brother Robert woke him from that dream, calling out, "Now, brother Svend, are we really ready? See here! But stop, kneel first. There! Now am I the bishop!" And he pulled his brother down onto his knees, and put on his head, where it fitted loosely enough now, hanging down from left to right, an iron crown, fantastically wrought, which he himself, having just finished it, had taken out of the water, cool and dripping. Robert and Harold laughed loud when they saw the crown hanging all askew, and the great drops rolling from it into Sven's eyes, and down his cheeks, looking like tears. Not so Sven. He rose, holding the crown level on his head, holding it back so that it pressed against his brow hard, and, first dashing the drops to right and left, caught his brother by the hand and said, " May I keep it, Robert? I shall wear it some day." " Yea," said the other, " but it is a poor thing. Better let Sieur put it in the furnace again and make it into sword hilts." Thereupon they began to go, Sven holding the crown in his hand. But as they were going, Sieur called out, " Yet will I sell my dagger at a price, Prince Sven, even as you wished at first, rather than give it you for nothing." " Well, for what ?" said Sven, somewhat shortly, for he thought Sieur was going back from his promise, which seemed ugly to him. " Nay, be not angry, Prince," said the armourer, " only I pray you to satisfy this whim of mine. It is the first favour I have asked of you. Will you ask the fair, noble lady, your mother, from Sieur the smith, if she is happy now?" " Willingly, sweet Master Sieur, if it pleases you. Farewell." And with happy young faces they went away. And when they were gone, Sieur, from a secret place, drew out various weapons and armour, and began to work at them, having first drawn bolt and bar of his workshop carefully. Sven, with Harold and Robert, his two brethren, went their ways to the Queen, and found her sitting alone in a fair court of the palace, full of flowers, with a marble cloister round about it. And when she saw them coming, she rose up to meet them, her 3 fair sons. Truly, as that right royal woman bent over them lovingly, there seemed little need of Sieur's question. So Sven showed her his dagger, but not the crown, and she asked many questions concerning Sieur the smith, about his way of talking and his face, the colour of his hair even, till the boys wondered, she questioned them so closely with beaming eyes and glowing cheeks, so that Sven thought he had never before seen his mother look so beautiful. Then Sven said, " And, mother, don't be angry with Sieur, will you, because he sent a message to you by me?" Angry? And straightway her soul was wandering where her body could not come, and for a moment or two she was living as before, with him close by her, in the old mountain land. " Well, mother, he wanted me to ask you if you are happy now." " Did he, Sven, this man with brown hair, grizzled as you say it is now? Is his hair soft then, this Sieur, going down onto his shoulders in waves? And his eyes, do they glow steadily as if lighted up from his heart? And how does he speak? Did you not tell me that his words led you, whether you would or no, into dreamland? Ah, well, tell him I am happy, but not so happy as we shall be, as we were. And so you, son Robert, are getting to be quite a cunning smith. But do you think you will ever beat Sieur?" "Ah, mother, no," he said. "There is something with him that makes him seem quite infinitely beyond all other workmen I have ever heard of." Some memory coming from that dreamland smote upon her heart more than the others. She blushed like a young girl, and said hesitatingly, "Does he work with his left hand, son Robert? For I have heard that some men do so." But in her heart she remembered how once, long ago in the old mountain country, in her father's house, someone had said that only men who were born so could do cunningly with the left hand, and how Sieur, then quite a boy, had said, "Well, I will try," and how in a month or two he had come to her with an armlet of silver, very curiously wrought, which he had done with his own left hand. So Robert said, "Yea, mother, he works with his left hand almost as much as with his right, and sometimes I have seen him change the hammer suddenly from his right hand to his left, with a kind of half smile, as one who would say, 'Cannot I then?' and this more when he does smith's work in metal than when he works in marble. And once I heard him say, when he did so, 'I wonder where my first left-hand work is.' Ah, I bide my time. I wonder also, mother, what he meant by that." She answered no word, but shook her arm free from its broad sleeve, and something glittered on it, near her wrist, something wrought out of silver, set with quaint and uncouthly cut stones of little value. In the council chamber among the lords sat Svend and his 6 brethren, he chief of all in the wielding of sword or axe, in the government of people, in drawing the love of men and women to him. Perfect in face and body, in wisdom and strength was Svend. Next to him sat Robert, cunning in working of marble or wood or brass. All things could he make to look as if they lived, from the sweep of an angel's wings down to the slipping of a little field mouse from under the sheaves in harvest time. Then there was Harold, who knew concerning all the stars of heaven and flowers of earth. Richard, who drew men's hearts from their bodies with the words that swung to and fro in his glorious rhymes. William, to whom the air of heaven seemed a servant when the harp-strings quivered underneath his fingers. There were the 2 sailor brothers, who the year before, young though they were, had come back from a long perilous voyage, with news of an island they had found long and long away to the west, larger than any that this people knew of, but very fair and good, though uninhabited. But now over all this noble brotherhood, with its various gifts, hung one cloud of sorrow. Their mother, the Peace Queen Sicela, was dead. She who had taught them truth and nobleness so well, she was never to see the beginning of the end that they would work. Truly it seemed sad. There sat the 7 brothers in the council chamber, waiting for the king, speaking no word, only thinking drearily, and under the pavement of the great church Sicela lay, and by the side of her tomb stood 2 men, old men both, Waldemar the king and Sieur. So the king, after that he had gazed a while on the carven face of her he had loved so well, said at last, "Now, Sir Carver, must you carve me also to lie there?" And he pointed to the vacant space by the side of the fair alabaster figure. "O King," said Sieur, "except for a very few strokes on steel, I have done work now, having carved the Queen there. I cannot do this thing for you." What was it sent a sharp pang of bitterest suspicion through the very heart of the poor old man. He looked steadfastly at him for a moment or 2, as if he would know all secrets. He could not, he had not strength of life enough to get to the bottom of things. Doubt vanished soon from his heart, and his face under Sieur's pitying gaze, he said, "Then perhaps I shall be my own statue." And therewithal he sat down on the edge of the low marble tomb and laid his right arm across her breast. He fixed his eyes on the eastern belt of windows, and sat quite motionless and silent, and he never knew that she loved him not. But Sieur, when he had gazed at him for a while, stole away quietly, as we do when we fear to awaken a sleeper, and the king never turned his head, but still sat there, never moving, scarce breathing it seemed. Sieur stood in his own great hall, for his house was large. He stood before the dais, and saw a fair sight, the work of his own hands. For fronting him against the wall were 7 thrones, and behind them a cloth of samite of purple, wrought with golden stars, and barred across from right to left with long bars of silver and crimson, and edged below with melancholy, fading green, like a September sunset, and opposite each throne was a glittering suit of armour, wrought wonderfully in bright steel, except that on the breast of each suit was a face worked marvellously in enamel, the face of Sicela in a glory of golden hair, and the glory of that gold spread away from the breast on all sides, and ran cunningly along with the steel rings in such a way as it is hard even to imagine. Moreover, on the crest of each helm was wrought the phoenix, the never-dying bird, the only creature that knows the sun, and by each suit lay a gleaming sword, terrible to look at, steel from pommel to point, but wrought along the blade in burnished gold that outflashed the gleam of the steel, was written in fantastic letters the word "Westward." So Sieur gazed till he heard footsteps coming. Then he turned to meet them, and Svend and his brethren sat silent in the council chamber till they heard a great noise and clamour of the people arise through all the streets. Then they rose to see what it might be. Meanwhile, on the low marble tomb, under the dim sweeping vault, sat, or rather lay, the King, for though his right arm still lay over her breast, his head had fallen forward and rested now on the shoulder of the marble Queen. There he lay, with strange confusion of his scarlet, gold-wrought robes, silent, motionless, and dead. The 7 brethren stood together on a marble terrace of the royal palace that was dotted about on the balusters of it with white statues. They were helmeted and armed to the teeth. Only over their armour great black cloaks were thrown. Now the whole great terrace was asway with the crowd of nobles and princes, and others that were neither nobles or princes, but true men only, and these were helmeted and wrapped in black cloaks, even as the princes were, only the crests of the princes' helms were wrought wonderfully with that bird, the phoenix, all flaming with new power, dying because its old body is not strong enough for its new-found power. And those on that terrace who were unarmed had anxious faces, some fearful, some stormy with devil's rage at disappointment. But among the faces of those helmed ones, though here and there you might see a pale face, there was no fear or rage, scarcely even any anxiety, but calm, brave joy seemed to be on all. Above the heads of all men on that terrace shone out Sven's brave face, the golden hair flowing from out of his helmet, a smile of quiet confidence overflowing from his mighty heart, in the depths of which it was dwelling, just showed a very little on his eyes and lips, while all the vast square and all the windows and roofs even of the houses over against the palace were alive with innumerable sea of troubled raging faces, showing white, upturned from the undersea of their many-coloured raiment. The murmur from them was like the sough of the first tempest wind among the pines, and the gleam of spears here and there like the last few gleams of sun through the woods when the black thunder clouds came up over all, soon to be shone through, those woods, by the gleam of the deep lightning. Also sometimes the murmur would swell, and from the heart of it would come a fierce, hoarse, tearing, shattering roar, strangely discordant, of "War! War! Give us war, O King!" Then Sven, stepping forward, his arms hidden under his long cloak as they hung down quietly, the smile on his face broadening somewhat, sent from his chest a mighty, effortless voice over all the raging. "Hear, O ye people! War with all that is ugly and base, peace with all that is fair and good. No war with my brother's people." Just then one of those unhelmeted, creeping round about stealthily to the place where Sven stood, lifted his arm and smote at him with a dagger, whereupon Sven, clearing his right arm from his cloak with his left, lifted up his glittering right hand, and the traitor fell to the earth, groaning with a broken jaw, for Sven had smitten him on the mouth a backward blow with his open hand. One shouted from the crowd, "Aye, murderer Sven, slay our good nobles as you poisoned the King your father, that you and your false brethren might oppress us with the memory of that devil's witch your mother." The smile left Sven's face and heart now. He looked very stern as he said, "Hear, O ye people! In years past, when I was a boy, my dream of dreams was ever this, how I should make you good, and because good, happy when I should become king over you. But as year by year passed, I saw my dream flitting, the deep colours of it changed, faded, grew grey in the light of coming manhood. Nevertheless, God be my witness that I have ever striven to make you just and true, hoping against hope continually. And I had even determined to bear everything and stay with you, even though you should remain unjust and liars, for the sake of the few who really love me. But now, seeing that God has made you mad, and that his vengeance will speedily fall, take heed how you cast out from you all that is good and true-hearted. Once more, which choose you, peace or war?" Between the good and the base, in the midst of the passionate faces and changing colours, stood the great terrace, cold and calm and white, with its changeless statues. And for a while there was silence. broken through at last by a yell and the sharp whir of arrows and the cling-clang from the armour of the terrace as Prince Harold staggered through unhurt, struck by the broad point on the helmet. ' What, war ?' shouted Svent wrathfully, and his voice sounded like a clap of thunder following the lightning flash when a tower is struck. ' What, war ? Swords for Svend ! Round about the King, good men and true ! Sons of the Golden Haired, show these men war !' As he spoke he let his black cloak fall, and up from their sheaths sprang 7 swords, steel from pommel to point only. On the blades of them, in fantastic letters of gold, shone the word ' Westward.' Then all the terrace gleamed with steel, and amid the hurtling of stones and whiz of arrows they began to go westward. The streets ran with blood, the air was filled with groans and curses, the low waves nearest the granite pier were edged with blood, because they first caught the drippings of the blood. Then those of the people who durst stay on the pier saw the ships of Svend's little fleet leaving one by one, for he had taken aboard those 10 ships whosoever had prayed to go, even at the last moment, wounded or dying even. Better so, for in their last moments came thoughts of good things to many of them, and it was good to be among the true. But those haughty ones left behind, sullen and untamed, but with a horrible indefinable dread on them that was worse than death or mere pain, howsoever fierce, these saw all the ships go out of the harbour merrily with swelling sail and dashing oar, and with joyous singing of those aboard. And Sven's was the last of all, whom they saw kneel down on the deck unhelmed. Then all sheathed their swords that were about him, and the Prince Robert took from Sven's hand an iron crown fantastically wrought, and placed it on his head as he knelt. Then he continued kneeling still, till, as the ship drew further and further away from the harbour, all things aboard of her became indistinct, and they never saw Svent and his brethren again. Here ends what William the Englishman wrote, but afterwards, in the night time, he found the book of a certain chronicler, which saith, in the springtime, in May, the 550th year from the death of Svent, the wonderful king, the good knights, sailing due eastward, came to a harbour of land they knew not, wherein they saw many goodly ships, but of a strange fashion, like the ships of the ancients, and destitute of any mariners. Besides, they saw no beacons for the guidance of seamen, nor was there any sound of bells or singing, though the city was vast, with many goodly towers and palaces. So when they landed they found that which is hardly to be believed, but which is nevertheless true. For about the quays and about the streets lay many people dead, or stood, but quite without motion, and they were all white or about the colour of new-hewn freestone. Yet were they not statues, but real men, for they had some of them ghastly wounds, which showed their entrails, and the structure of their flesh and veins and bones. Moreover, the streets were red and wet with blood, and the harbour waves were red with it, because it dripped in great drops slowly from the quays. Then, when the good knights saw this, they doubted not but that it was a fearful punishment on this people for sins of theirs. Thereupon they entered into a church of that city, and prayed God to pardon them. Afterwards, going back to their ships, sailed away marvelling. And I, John, who wrote this history, saw all this with mine own eyes. End of Svent and his Brethren, by William Morris. End of Part 7. Part 8 of Prose Romances from the Oxford and Cambridge Magazine, by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lindenborg Pool, Oxford and Cambridge Magazine, September 1856. Footnote: See Thorpe's Northern Mythology, Volume 2, page 214. I read once in a lazy humour Thorpe's Northern Mythology on a cold May night when the north wind was blowing. In lazy humour, but when I came to the tale that is here amplified, there was something in it that fixed my attention and made me think of it. And whether I would or no, my thoughts ran in this way, as here follows. So I felt obliged to write and wrote accordingly, and by the time I had done, the grey light filled all my room. So I put out my candles and went to bed, not without fear and trembling, for the morning twilight is so strange and lonely. This is what I wrote. Yes, on that dark night, with that wild unsteady north wind howling, though it was Maytime, it was doubtless dismal enough in the forest, where the boughs crashed eerily, and where, as the wanderer in that place hurried along, strange forms half showed themselves to him, the more fearful because half seen in that way. Dismal enough, doubtless, on wide moors where the great wind had it all its own way. Dismal on the rivers creeping on and on between the marshlands, creeping through the willows, the water trickling through the locks, sounding faintly in the gusts of the wind. Yet surely nowhere so dismal as by the side of that still pool. I threw myself down on the ground there, utterly exhausted with my struggle against the wind, and with bearing the fathoms and fathoms of the heavily laden plumb line that lay beside me. Fierce as the wind was, it could not raise the leaden waters of that fearful pool, defended as they were by the steep banks of dripping yellow clay, striped horribly here and there with ghastly uncertain green and blue. They said no man could fathom it, and yet all round the edges of it grew a rank crop of dreary reeds and segs, some round, some flat, but none ever flowering as other things flowered, never dying and being renewed, but always the same stiff array of unbroken reeds and segs, some round, some flat. Hard by me were two trees, leafless and ugly, made, it seemed, only for the wind to go through with a wild sough on such nights as these, and for a mile from that place were no other trees. True, I could not see all this at that time, then in the dark night, but I knew well that it was all there. For much had I studied this pool in the daytime, trying to learn the secret of it. Many hours I had spent there, happy with a kind of happiness, because forgetful of the past. And even now, could I not hear the wind going through those trees as it never went through any trees before or since? Could I not see gleams of the dismal moor? Could I not hear those reeds just taken by the wind, knocking against each other, the flat ones scraping all along the round ones? Could I not hear, moreover, the slow trickling of the land springs through the clay banks? The cold chill horror of the place was too much for me. I had never been there by night before, nobody had for quite a long time, and now to come on such a night. If there had been any moon, the place would have looked more as it did by day. Besides, the moon shining on water is always so beautiful, on any water even. If it had been starlight, one could have looked at the stars and thought of the time when those fields were fertile and beautiful, for such a time was, I am sure, when the cowslips grew among the grass, and when there was promise of yellow waving corn, stained with poppies. That time which the stars had seen, but which we had never seen, which even they would never see again. Past time. Ah, what was that touched my shoulder? Yes, I see, only a dead leaf. Yes, to be here on this 8th of May, too, of all nights in the year, the night of that awful day when 10 years ago I slew him. Not undeservedly, God knows, yet how dreadful it was. Another leaf, and another. Strange, those trees have been dead this 100 years, I should think. How sharp the wind is, too, just as if I were moving along and meeting it. Why, I am moving. What then? Am I not there after all? Where am I then? There are the trees. No, they are freshly planted oak saplings. the very ones that those withered last year's leaves were blown on me from. I have been dreaming, then, and am on my road to the lake. But what a young wood ! I must have lost my way. I never saw all this before. Well, I will walk on stoutly. May the Lord help my senses, I am riding on a mule. A bell tinkles somewhere on him. The wind blows something about with a flapping sound. Something? In heaven's name, what? My long black robes. Why, when I left my house I was clad in serviceable broadcloth of the 19th century. I shall go mad. I am mad. I am gone to the devil. I have lost my identity. Who knows in what place, in what age of the world I am living now? Yet I will be calm. I have seen all these things before, in pictures surely, or something like them. I am resigned, since it is no worse than that. I am a priest, then, in the dim, far-off 13th century, riding about midnight, I should say, to carry the blessed sacrament to some dying man. Soon I found that I was not alone. A man was riding close to me on a horse. He was fantastically dressed, more so than usual for that time, being striped all over in vertical stripes of yellow and green, with quaint birds like exaggerated storks in different attitudes counterchanged on the stripes. All this I saw by the lantern he carried, in the light of which his debauched black eyes quite flashed. On he went, unsteadily rolling, very drunk, though it was the 13th century, but being plainly used to that, he sat his horse fairly well. I watched him in my proper 19th century character, with insatiable curiosity and intense amusement, but as a quiet priest of a long past age, with contempt and disgust enough, not unmixed with fear and anxiety. He roared out snatches of doggerel verse as he went along, drinking songs, hunting songs, robbing songs, lust songs, in a voice that sounded far and far above the roaring of the wind, though that was high, and rolled along the dark road that his lantern cast spikes of light along ever so far, making the devils grin. And meanwhile I, the priest, glanced from him wrathfully every now and then to that which I carried very reverently in my hand, and my blood curdled with shame and indignation. But, being a shrewd priest, I knew well enough that a sermon would be utterly thrown away on a man who was drunk every day in the year, and, more especially, very drunk then. So I held my peace, saying only under my breath, Dixit incipiens in corde suo, non est Deus, corrupti sunt, et abominabiles facti sunt in studiis suis. Non est qui faciat bonum, non est usque ad unum, sepulchrum patens est gutur eorum. Linguis suis dolose agebant, venenum aspidum sub labiis eorum. Dominum non invocaverunt, illie trepidaverunt timore, ubi non erat timor. Quis dabit ex Sion salutare Israel? And so I went on, thinking too at times about the man who was dying, whom I was soon to see. He had been a bold and plundering baron, but was said lately to have altered his way of life, having seen a miracle or some such thing. He had departed to keep a tournament near his castle lately, but had been brought back sore wounded. So this drunken servant, with some difficulty and much unseasonable merriment, had made me understand, and now lay at the point of death, brought about by unskilful tending and such like. Then I thought of his face, a bad face, very bad, retreating forehead, small twinkling eyes, projecting lower jaw, and such a voice too he had, like the grunt of a boar mostly. Now don't you think it strange that this face should be the same, actually the same as the face of my enemy, slain that very day 10 years ago? I did not hate him, either that man or the Baron, but I wanted to see as little of him as possible, and I hoped that the ceremony would soon be over and that I should be at liberty again. And so, with these thoughts and many others, but all thought strangely double, we went along, the varlet being too drunk to take much notice of me, only once, as he was singing some doggerel like this, I think making allowances for change of language, and so forth. The Duke went to Trevor's on the 1st of November. His wife stayed at Bonn. Let me see, I remember. When the Duke came back to look for his wife, we came from Cologne and took the Duke's life. We hung him mid-high between spire and pavement. From their mouths dropped the cabbage of the Earls in amazement. Boo-hoo, church rat, church mouse. Hilloa, priest, have you brought the pixie? From some cause or other he seemed to think this an excellent joke, for he almost shrieked with laughter as we went along. But by this time we had reached the castle. Challenge and counter-challenge, and we passed the outermost gate, and began to go through some of the courts in which stood lime-trees here and there, growing green tenderly with that Maytime, though the north wind bit so keenly. How strange again! As I went farther, there seemed no doubt of it, here in the after-time came that pool, how I knew not, but in the few minutes that we were riding from the outer gate to the castle porch, I thought so intensely over the probable cause for the existence of that pool that, how strange, I could almost have thought I was back again, listening to the oozing of the land springs through the high clay banks there. I was wakened from that, before it grew too strong, by the glare of many torches, and, dismounting, found myself in the midst of some 20 attendants, with flushed faces and wildly sparkling eyes, which they were vainly trying to soften to due solemnity — mock solemnity I had almost said, for they did not seem to think it necessary to appear really solemn, and had difficulty enough, apparently, in not prolonging indefinitely the shout of laughter with which they had at first greeted me. " Take the Holy Father to my lord," said one at last, " and we will go with him." So they led me up the stairs into the gorgeously furnished chamber. The light from the heavy waxen candles was pleasant to my eyes after the glare and twisted red smoke of the pine torches, but all the essences scattered about the chamber were not enough to conquer the fiery breath of those about me. I put on the alb and stole they brought me, and before I went up to the sick man looked round on those that were in the rooms, for the rooms opened one into the other by many doors, across some of which hung gorgeous tapestry. All the rooms seemed to have many people, for some stood at these doors and some passed to and fro, swinging aside the heavy hangings. Once several people at once, seemingly quite by accident, drew aside almost all the veils from the doors and showed an endless perspective of gorgeousness. And at all these things my heart fainted for horror. Had not the Jews of late, thought I, the priest, been very much in the habit of crucifying children in mockery of the holiest, holding gorgeous feasts while they beheld the poor innocents die? These men are atheists. You are in a trap, yet quit yourself like a man. Ah, sharp one, thought I, the author. Where are you at last? Try to pray as a test. Well, well, these things are strangely like devils. Oh, man, you have talked about bravery often. Now is your time to practise it. Once and for all trust in God, or I fear you are lost. It increased my horror that there was no appearance of a woman in all these rooms, and yet was there not? There, those things. I looked more intently. Yes, no doubt they were women, but all dressed like men. What a ghastly place! Oh, man, do your duty, my angel said. Then, in spite of the bloodshot eyes of man and woman there, in spite of their bold looks, they quailed before me. I stepped up to the bedside, where under the velvet coverlid lay the dying man, his small sparkling eyes only, but dulled now by coming death, showing above the swathings. I was about to kneel down by the bedside to confess him, when one of those things called out. Now they had just been whispering and sniggering together, but the priest in his righteous brave scorn would not look at them. The humbled author, half fearful, half trustful, dared not. So one called out, "Sir Priest, For 3 days our master has spoken no articulate word. You must pass over all particulars. Ask for a sign only." Such a strange, ghastly suspicion flashed across me just then, but I choked it, and asked the dying man if he repented of his sins, and if he believed all that was necessary to salvation, and if so, to make a sign, if he were able. The man moved a little and groaned, so I took it for a sign, as he was clearly incapable either of speaking or moving, and accordingly began the service for the administration of the sacraments. And as I began, those behind me and through all the rooms — I know it was through all of them — began to move about in a bewildering dance-like motion, mazy and intricate. Yes, and presently music struck up through all those rooms, music and singing, lively and gay. Many of the tunes I had heard before, in the 19th century. I could have sworn to half a dozen of the polkas. The rooms grew fuller and fuller of people. They passed thick and fast between the rooms, and the hangings were continually rustling. One fat old man with a big belly crept under the bed where I was, and wheezed and chuckled there, laughing and talking to one who stooped down and lifted up the hangings to look at him. Still more and more people, talking and singing and laughing and twirling about, till my brain went round and round, and I scarce knew what I did. Yet somehow I could not leave off. I dared not even look over my shoulder, fearing lest I should see something so horrible as to make me die. So I got on with the service, and at last took the pyx, and took thereout the sacred wafer, whereupon was a deep silence through all those rooms, which troubled me, I think, more than all which had gone before, for I knew well it did not mean reverence. I held it up, that which I counted so holy, when lo, great laughter echoing like thunderclaps through all the rooms, not dulled by the veiling hangings, for they were all raised up together, and with a slow upheaval of the rich clothes among which he lay, with a sound that was half snarl, half grunt, with helpless body swathed in bedclothes, a huge swine that I had been shriving tore from me the holy thing, deeply scoring my hand as he did so with the tusk and tooth, so that the red blood ran quick onto the floor. Therewithal he rolled down onto the floor, and lay there helplessly, only able to roll to and fro because of the swathings. Then right madly skirled the intolerable laughter, rising to shrieks that were fearfuller than any scream of agony I ever heard. The hundreds of people through all those grand rooms danced and wheeled about me, shrieking, hemming me in with interlaced arms, the women loosing their long hair and thrusting forward their horribly grinning, unsexed faces toward me, till I felt their hot breath. Oh, how I hated them all, almost hated all mankind for their sakes. How I longed to get right quit of all men, among whom, as it seemed, all sacredest things even were made a mock of. I looked about me fiercely. I sprang forward and clutched a sword from the gilded belt of one of those who stood near me. With savage blows that threw the blood about the gilded walls and their hangings, right over the heads of those things, I cleared myself from them and tore down the great stairs madly, yet could not, as in a dream, go fast enough because of my passion. I was out in the courtyard among the lime trees soon, the north wind blowing freshly on my heated forehead in that dawn. The outer gate was locked and bolted. I stooped and raised a great stone and sent it at the lock with all my strength, and I was stronger than 10 men then. Iron and oak gave way before it, and through the ragged splinters I tore in reckless fury like a wild horse through a hazel hedge. And no one had pursued me. I knelt down on the dear green turf outside, and thanked God with streaming eyes for my deliverance, praying him forgiveness for my unwilling share in that night's mockery. Then I arose and turned to go, but even as I did so I heard a roar as if the world were coming in two, and looking toward the castle, saw, not a castle, but a great cloud of white lime dust, swaying this way and that in the gusts of the wind. Then, when the east grew bright, there arose a hissing, gurgling noise that swelled into the roar and wash of many waters, and by then the sun had risen. A deep black lake lay before my feet. And this is how I tried to fathom the Lindenborg Pool. End of the Lindenborg Pool by William Morris. End of Part 8. Part 9 of Prose Romances from the Oxford and Cambridge Magazine by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hollow Land, a Tale. Oxford and Cambridge Magazine, September and October 1856. Chapter 1. Struggling in the World. We find in ancient story wonders many told, of heroes in great glory, with spirits free and bold, of joyances and high tides, of weeping and of woe, of noble reckon striving. Mote ye now wonders know. Nibelungenlied. See Carlyle's Miscellanies. Do you know where it is, the Hollow Land? I have been looking for it now so long, trying to find it again, the Hollow Land, for there I saw my love first. I wish to tell you how I found it first of all, but I am old, my memory fails me. You must wait and let me think if I perchance can tell you how it happened. Yea, in my ears is a confused noise of trumpet blasts, singing over desolate moors. In my ears and eyes a clashing and clanging of horse hoofs, a ringing and glittering of steel, drawn back lips, set teeth, shouts, shrieks, and curses. How was it that none of us ever found it till that day? For it is near our country. But what time have we to look for it or any good thing, with such biting, carking cares hemming us in on every side? Cares about great things, mighty things, oh my brothers, or rather little things enough, if we only knew it. Lives passed in turmoil, in making one another unhappy, in bitterest misunderstanding of our brothers' hearts, making those sad whom God has not made sad. Alas, alas! What chance for any of us to find the Hollow Land? What time even to look for it? Yet who has not dreamed of it? Who, half miserable yet the while, for that he knows it is but a dream, has not felt the cool waves round his feet, the roses crowning him, and through the leaves of beech and lime the many whispering winds of the Hollow Land? Now, my name was Florian, and my house was the House of the Lilies, and of that house was my father lord, and after him my eldest brother Arnold, and me they called Florian de Lilies. Moreover, when my father was dead, there arose a feud between the Lilies house and Red Harold, and this that follows is the history of it. Lady Swanhilda, Red Harold's mother, was a widow with one son, Red Harold, and when she had been in widowhood 2 years, being of princely blood, and besides comely and fierce, King Urrain sent to demand her in marriage. And I remember seeing the procession leaving the town when I was quite a child, and many young knights and squires attended the Lady Swanhilda as pages, and amongst them Arnold, my eldest brother. And as I gazed out of the window, I saw him walking by the side of her horse, dressed in white and gold very delicately. But as he went, it chanced that he stumbled. Now he was one of those that held a golden canopy over the lady's head, so that it now sunk into wrinkles, and the lady had to bow her head full low, and even then the gold brocade caught in one of the long slim gold flowers that were wrought round the crown she wore. She flushed up in her rage, and her smooth face went suddenly into the carven wrinkles of a wooden water-spout, and she caught at the brocade with her left hand and pulled it away furiously, so that the warp and woof were twisted out of their places, and many gold threads were left dangling about the crown. But Swanhilda stared about when she rose, then smote my brother across the mouth with her gilded sceptre, and the red blood flowed all about his garments. Yet he only turned exceeding pale, and dared say no word, though he was heir to the House of the Lilies. But my small heart swelled with rage, and I vowed revenge, and, as it seems, he did too. So when Swanhilda had been queen 3 years, she suborned many of King Uraine's knights and lords, and slew her husband as she slept, and reigned in his stead. And her son Harold grew up to manhood, and was counted a strong knight, and well spoken of. By then I first put on my armour. Then one night, as I lay dreaming, I felt a hand laid on my face, and starting up saw Arnold before me fully armed. He said, ' Florian, rise and arm.' I did so, all but my helm, as he was. He kissed me on the forehead. His lips felt hot and dry, and when they brought torches, and I could see his face plainly, I saw he was very pale. He said, ' Do you remember, Florian, this day 16 years ago ? It is a long time, but I shall never forget it unless this night blots out its memory.' I knew what he meant, and because my heart was wicked I rejoiced exceedingly at the thought of vengeance, so that I could not speak, but only laid my palm across his lips. ' Good ! You have a good memory, Florian. See now, I waited long and long. I said at first I forgive her, but when the news came concerning the death of the King, and how that she was shameless, I said I will take it as a sign, if God does not punish her within certain years, that He means me to do so. And I have been watching and watching now these 2 years for an opportunity, and behold it is come at last. And I think God has certainly given her into our hands, for she rests this night, this very Christmas Eve, at a small walled town on the frontier, not 2 hours' gallop from this. They keep little ward there, and the night is wild. Moreover, the prior of a certain house of monks, just without the walls, is my fast friend in this matter, for she has done him some great injury. In the courtyard below 150 knights and squires, all faithful and true, are waiting for us. One moment and we shall be gone.' Then we both knelt down and prayed God to give her into our hands. We put on our helms and went down into the courtyard. It was the first time I expected to use a sharp sword in anger, and I was full of joy as the muffled thunder of our horse hoofs rolled through the bitter winter night. In about an hour and a half we had crossed the frontier, and in half an hour more the greater part had halted in a wood near the Abbey, while I and a few others went up to the Abbey gates and knocked loudly 4 times with my sword hilt, stamping on the ground meantime. A long, low whistle answered me from within, which I in my turn answered. Then the wicket opened, and a monk came out holding a lantern. He seemed yet in the prime of life, and was a tall, powerful man. He held the lantern to my face, then smiled and said, ' The banners hang low. I gave the countersign. The crest is lopped off. Good, my son,' said he, ' the ladders are within here. I dare not trust any of the brethren to carry them for you, though they love not the witch either, but are timorsome.' ' No matter,' I said, ' I have men here.' So they entered and began to shoulder the tall ladders. The prior was very busy. ' You will find them just the right length, my son, trust me for that.' He seemed quite a jolly, pleasant man. I could not understand his nursing furious revenge, but his face darkened strangely whenever he happened to mention her name. As we were starting he came and stood outside the gate, and, putting his lantern down, that the light of it might not confuse his sight, looked earnestly into the night, then said, ' The wind has fallen. The snowflakes get thinner and smaller every moment. In an hour it will be freezing hard, and will be quite clear. Everything depends upon the surprise being complete. Stop a few minutes yet, my son.' He went away chuckling, and returned presently with 2 more sturdy monks carrying something. They threw their burdens down before my feet. They consisted of all the white albs in the Abbey. There, trust an old man who has seen more than one stricken fight in his carnal days. Let the men who scale the walls put these over their arms, and they will not be seen the least. God make your sword sharp, my son.' So we departed, and when I met Arnold again he said that what the Prior had done was well thought of. So we agreed that I should take 30 men, an old squire of our house, well skilled in war, along with them, scale the walls as quietly as possible, and open the gates to the rest. I set off accordingly, after that with low laughing we had put the albs all over us, wrapping the ladders also in white. Then we crept very warily and slowly up the wall. The moat was frozen over, and on the ice the snow lay quite thick. We all thought that the guards must be careless enough when they did not even take the trouble to break the ice in the moat. So we listened. There was no sound at all. The Christmas midnight mass had long ago been over. It was nearly 3 o'clock, and the moon began to clear. There was scarce any snow falling now, only a flake or two from some low hurrying cloud or other. The wind sighed gently about the round towers there, but it was bitter cold, for it had begun to freeze again. We listened for some minutes, about a quarter of an hour, I think. Then, at a sign from me, they raised the ladders carefully, muffled as they were at the top with swathings of wool. I mounted first. Old Squire Hugh followed last. Noiselessly we ascended, and soon stood all together on the walls. Then we carefully lowered the ladders again with long ropes. We got our swords and axes from out of the folds of our priests' raiments, and set forward till we reached the first tower along the wall. The door was open. In the chamber at the top there was a fire slowly smouldering. Nothing else. We passed through it, and began to go down the spiral staircase, I first, with my axe shortened in my hand. What if we were surprised there? I thought, and I longed to be out in the air again. What if the door were fast at the bottom? As we passed the second chamber, we heard someone within snoring loudly. I looked in quietly and saw a big man with long black hair that fell off his pillow and swept the ground, lying snoring, with his nose turned up and his mouth open. But he seemed so sound asleep that we did not stop to slay him. Praise be! The door was open. Without even a whispered word, without a pause, we went on along the streets, on the side that the drift had been on, because our garments were white, for the wind being very strong all that day, the houses on that side had caught in their cornices and carvings, and on the rough stone wood of them, so much snow that except here and there where the black walls grinned out, they were quite white. No man saw us as we stole along noiselessly because of the snow, till we stood within 100 yards of the gates and their house of guard, and we stood because we heard the voice of someone singing: Queen Mary's crown was gold, King Joseph's crown was red, but Jesus' crown was diamond that lit up all the bed. Mariae Virginis. So they had some guards after all. This was clearly the sentinel that sung to keep the ghosts off. Now for a fight. We drew nearer, a few yards nearer, then stopped to free ourselves from our monks' clothes. Ships sail through the heaven, with red banners dressed, carrying the planets 7 to see the white breast. Mariae Virginis. Thereat he must have seen the waving of some alb or other as it shivered down to the ground, for his spear fell with a thud, and he seemed to be standing open-mouthed, thinking something about ghosts. Then, plucking up heart of grace, he roared out like 10 bull-calves and dashed into the guard-house. We followed smartly but without hurry, and came up to the door of it just as some dozen half-armed men came tumbling out under our axes. Thereupon, while our men slew them, I blew a great blast upon my horn, and Hugh with some others drew bolt and bar and swung the gates wide open. Then the men in the guard-house understood they were taken in a trap, and began to stir with great confusion. So, lest they should get quite waked and armed, I left Hugh at the gates with 10 men, and myself led the rest into that house. There, while we slew all those that yielded not, came Arnold with the others, bringing our horses with them. Then all the enemy threw their arms down, and we counted our prisoners and found them over 80. Therefore, not knowing what to do with them, for they were too many to guard, and it seemed unknightly to slay them all, we sent up some bowmen to the walls, and, turning our prisoners out of gates, bid them run for their lives, which they did fast enough, not knowing our numbers. And our man sent a few flights of arrows among them, that they might not be undeceived. Then the 1 or 2 prisoners that we had left told us, when we had crossed our axes over their heads, that the people of the good town would not willingly fight us, in that they hated the Queen, that she was guarded at the palace by some 50 knights, and that, beside, there were no others to oppose us in the town. So we set out for the palace, spear in hand. We had not gone far before we heard some knights coming, and soon, in a turn of the long street, we saw them riding towards us. When they caught sight of us they seemed astonished, drew rein, and stood in some confusion. We did not slacken our pace for an instant, but rode right at them with a yell, to which I lent myself with all my heart. After all, they did not run away, but waited for us with their spears held out. I missed the man I had marked, or hit him, rather, just on the top of the helm. He bent back, and the spear slipped over his head, but my horse still kept on, and I felt presently such a crash that I reeled in my saddle and felt mad. He had lashed out at me with his sword as I came on, hitting me in the ribs, for my arm was raised, but only flatlings. I was quite wild with rage. I turned, almost fell upon him, caught him by the neck with both hands, and threw him under the horse hoofs, sighing with fury. I heard Arnold's voice close to me, ' Well fought, Florian !' and I saw his great stern face bare among the iron, for he had made a vow, in remembrance of that blow, always to fight unhelmed. I saw his great sword swinging in wide gyres and hissing as it started up, just as if it were alive and liked it. So joy filled all my soul, and I fought with my heart till the big axe I swung felt like nothing but a little hammer in my hand, except for its bitterness. And as for the enemy, they went down like grass, so that we destroyed them utterly, for those knights would neither yield nor fly, but died as they stood, so that some 15 of our men also died there. Then at last we came to the palace, where some grooms and such like kept the gate armed, but some ran, and some we took prisoners, one of whom died for sheer terror in our hands, being stricken by no wound, for he thought we would eat him. These prisoners we questioned concerning the Queen, and so entered the great hall. There Arnold sat down in the throne on the dais, and laid his naked sword before him on the table, and on each side of him sat such knights as there was room for, and the others stood round about, while I took 10 men and went to look for Swanhilda. I found her soon, sitting by herself in a gorgeous chamber. I almost pitied her when I saw her looking so utterly desolate and despairing. Her beauty, too, had faded, deep lines cut through her face, but when I entered she knew who I was, and her look of intense hatred was so fiend-like that it changed my pity into horror of her. ' Knight,' she said, ' who are you, and what do you want, thus discourteously entering my chamber? I am Florian de Lillis, and I am to conduct you to judgment.' She sprung up. ' Curse you and your whole house. You I hate worse than any. Girl's face ! Guards ! Guards !' And she stamped on the ground. Her veins on the forehead swelled, her eyes grew round and flamed out, and she kept crying for her guards, stamping the while, for she seemed quite mad. Then at last she remembered that she was in the power of her enemies. She sat down and lay with her face between her hands, and wept passionately. "Which?" I said between my closed teeth. "Will you come, or must we carry you down to the great hall?" Neither would she come, but sat there, clutching at her dress and tearing her hair. Then I said, "Bind her and carry her down," and they did so. I watched Arnold as we came in. There was no triumph on his stern white face, but resolution enough. He had made up his mind. They placed her on a seat in the midst of the hall over against the dais. He said, "Unbind her, Florian." They did so. She raised her face and glared defiance at us all, as though she would die queenly after all. Then rose up Arnold and said, "Queen Swanhilda, we judge you guilty of death, and because you are a queen and of a noble house you shall be slain by my knightly sword, and I will even take the reproach of slaying a woman, for no other hand than mine shall deal the blow." Then she said, "Oh, false knight, show your warrant from God, man or devil." "This warrant from God, Swanhilda," he said, holding up his sword. "Listen. 15 years ago, when I was just winning my spurs, you struck me, disgracing me before all the people. You cursed me, and meant that curse well enough. Men of the House of the Lilies, what sentence for that?" "Death," they said. "Listen. Afterwards you slew my cousin, your husband, treacherously in the most cursed way, stabbing him in the throat as the stars in the canopy above him look down on the shut eyes of him. Men of the House of the Lily, what sentence for that?" "Death," they said. "Do you hear them, Queen? There is warrant from man. For the devil, I do not reverence him enough to take warrant from him, but, as I look on that face of yours, I think that even he has left you." And indeed, just then all her pride seemed to leave her. She fell from the chair and wallowed on the ground, moaning. She wept like a child, so that the tears lay on the oak floor. She prayed for another month of life. She came to me and kneeled, and kissed my feet, and prayed piteously, so that water ran out of her mouth. But I shuddered and drew away. It was like having an adder about one. I could have pitied her had she died bravely, but for one like her to whine and whine — pah! Then from the dais rang Arnold's voice, terrible, much changed. "Let there be an end of all this," and he took his sword and strode through the hall towards her. She rose from the ground and stood up, stooping a little, her head sunk between her shoulders, her black eyes turned up and gleaming like a tigress about to spring. When he came within some 6 paces of her, something in his eye daunted her, or perhaps the flashing of his terrible sword in the torchlight. She threw her arms up with a great shriek, and dashed screaming about the hall. Arnold's lip never once curled with any scorn, no line in his face changed. He said, "Bring her here and bind her." But when one came up to her to lay hold on her, she first of all ran at him, hitting him with her head in the belly. Then, while he stood doubled up for want of breath, and staring with his head up, she caught his sword from the girdle and cut him across the shoulders, and many others she wounded sorely before they took her. Then Arnold stood by the chair to which she was bound, and poised his sword, and there was a great silence. Then he said, "Men of the House of Lilies, do you justify me in this? Shall she die?" Straightway rang a great shout through the hall, but before it died away the sword had swept round, and therewithal was there no such thing as Swanhilda left upon the earth. For in no battlefield had Arnold struck truer blow. Then he turned to the few servants of the palace and said, "Go now, bury this accursed woman, for she is a king's daughter." Then to us all, "Now, knights, to horse and away, that we may reach the good town by about dawn." So we mounted and rode off. What a strange Christmas day that was, for there about 9 o'clock in the morning rode Red Harold into the good town to demand vengeance. He went at once to the King, and the King promised that before nightfall that very day the matter should be judged, albeit the King feared somewhat, because every third man you met in the streets had a blue cross on his shoulder, and some likeness of a lily, cut out or painted, stuck in his hat. And this blue cross and lily were the bearings of our house, called De Lilies. Now we had seen Red Harold pass through the streets with a white banner borne before him, to show that he came peaceably as for this time, but I trow he was thinking of other things than peace. And he was called Red Harold first at this time, because over all his arms he wore a great scarlet cloth that fell in heavy folds about his horse and all about him. Then, as he passed our house, someone pointed it out to him, rising there with its carving and its barred marble, but stronger than many a castle on the hilltops, and its great overhanging battlement cast a mighty shadow down the wall and across the street. And above all rose the great tower, our banner floating proudly from the top, whereon was emblazoned on a white ground a blue cross, and on a blue ground 4 white lilies. And now faces were gazing from all the windows, and all the battlements were thronged. So Harold turned, and rising in his stirrups, shook his clenched fist at our house. Natheless as he did so, the east wind, coming down the street, caught up the corner of that scarlet cloth and drove it over his face, and therewithal disordering his long black hair, well nigh choked him, so that he bit both his hair and that cloth. So from base to cope rose a mighty shout of triumph and defiance, and he passed on. Then Arnold caused it to be cried that all those who loved the good house of the Lilies should go to mass that morning in St. Mary's Church, hard by our house. Now this church belonged to us, and the abbey that served it, and always we appointed the abbot of it on condition that our trumpets should sound all together when on high masses they sing the Gloria in Excelsis. It was the largest and most beautiful of all the churches in the town, and had 2 exceeding high towers, which you could see from far off, even when you saw not the town or any of its other towers. And in one of these towers were 12 great bells, named after the 12 apostles, one name being written on each one of them, as Peter, Matthew, and so on. And in the other tower was one great bell only, much larger than any of the others, and which was called Mary. Now this bell was never rung but when our house was in great danger, and it had this legend on it: "When Mary rings, the earth shakes." And indeed from this we took our war cry, which was "Mary rings," somewhat justifiably indeed, for the last time that Mary rung, on that day before nightfall, there were 4,000 bodies to be buried, which bodies wore neither cross nor lily. So Arnold gave me in charge to tell the Abbot to cause Mary to be tolled for an hour before Mass that day. The Abbot leaned on my shoulder as I stood within the tower, and looked at the 12 monks laying their hands to the ropes. Far up in the dimness I saw the wheel before it began to swing round about. Then it moved a little. The 12 men bent down to the earth, and a roar rose that shook the tower from base to spire vane. Backwards and forwards swept the wheel, as Mary now looked downwards towards earth, now looked up at the shadowy cone of the spire, shot across by bars of light from the dormers. And the thunder of Mary was caught up by the wind and carried through all the country, and when the good man heard it, he said good-bye to wife and child, slung his shield behind his back, and set forward with his spear sloped over his shoulder. And many a time, as he walked toward the good town, he tightened the belt that went about his waist, that he might stride the faster, so long and furiously did Mary toll. And before the great bell Mary had ceased ringing, all the ways were full of armed men. But at each door of the church of St. Mary stood a row of men armed with axes, and when any came, meaning to go into the church, the 2 first of these would hold their axes, whose helves were about 4 feet long, over his head, and would ask him, Who went over the moon last night? Then, if he answered nothing or at random, they would bid him turn back, which he, for the more part, would be ready enough to do. But some, striving to get through that row of men, were slain outright. But if he were one of those that were friends to the House of Lilies, he would answer to that question. Mary and John. By the time the Mass began, the whole church was full, and in the nave and transept thereof were 3,000 men, all of our house, and all armed. But Arnold and myself and Squire Hugh and some others sat under a gold-fringed canopy near the choir, and the Abbot said Mass, having his mitre on his head. Yet, as I watched him, it seemed to me that he must have something on beneath his priest's vestments, for he looked much fatter than usual, being really a tall, lithe man. Now, as they sung the Kyrie, someone shouted from the other end of the church, "My Lord Arnold, they are slaying our people without!" For indeed all the square about the church was full of our people, who for the press had not been able to enter, and were standing there in no small dread of what might come to pass. Then the Abbot turned round from the altar and began to fidget with the fastenings of his rich robes, and they made a lane for us up to the west door. Then I put on my helm, and we began to go up to the nave. Then suddenly the singing of the monks and all stopped. I heard a clinking and a buzz of voices in the choir. I turned and saw that the bright noon sun was shining on the gold of the priest's vestments as they lay on the floor, and on the mail that the priests carried. So we stopped, the choir gates swung open, and the Abbot marched out at the head of his men, all fully armed, and began to strike up the psalm, Exsurgat Deus. When we got to the west door there was indeed a tumult, but as yet no slaying. The square was all a-flicker with steel, and we beheld a great body of knights at the head of them, Red Harold and the King standing over against us. But our people, pressed against the houses and into the corners of the square, were some striving to enter the doors, some beside themselves with rage, shouting out to the others to charge. Withal, some were pale and some were red with the blood that had gathered to the wrathful faces of them. Then said Arnold to those about him, "Lift me up." So they laid a great shield on 2 lances, and these 4 men carried, and thereon stood Arnold and gazed about him. Now the King was unhelmed, and his white hair, for he was an old man, flowed down behind him onto his saddle, but Arnold's hair was cut short and was red, and all the bells rang. Then the King said, "O Arnold of the Lilies, will you settle this quarrel by the judgment of God?" And Arnold thrust up his chin and said, "Yea." "How then?" said the King, "and where?" "Will it please you to try now?" said Arnold. Then the King understood what he meant, and took in his hand from behind tresses of his long white hair, twisting them round his hand in his wrath, but yet said no word, till I suppose his hair put him in mind of something, and he raised it in both his hands above his head and shouted out aloud, "O knights, hearken to this traitor!" Whereat indeed the lances began to move ominously. But Arnold spoke. "O you King and lords, what have we to do with you? Were we not free in the old time, up among the hills there? Wherefore give way, and we will go to the hills again. And if any man try to stop us, his blood be on his own head. Wherefore now," and he turned, "all you House of the Lily, both soldiers and monks, let us go forth together, fearing nothing. For I think there is not bone enough or muscle enough in these fellows here that have a king, that they should stop us withal, but only skin and fat." And truly no man dared to stop us, and we went. End of Part 9.